So welcome to Neurodiversity Awareness. So it's about understanding and supporting adults with neurodiverse conditions. And because I'm neurodiverse and I live in a neurodiverse household, and in fact, throughout my career, actually, really, I've come across lots of other neurodiverse adults. And we're just trying our best to thrive, really, with a work-life balance and whatever life throws at us. So that's why I'm doing this free webinar about neurodiversity awareness and support. And although mainly it's things that could be utilised in the workplace, there's suggestions and information here that hopefully will be applicable to all different aspects of life. And this coming week is National Inclusivity Week, where as a nation we're actually asked to stand up and take action to make our workplaces a more inclusive environment in general. And coinciding with that, this is what happens when you're a wellbeing practitioner. You get to hear about all the different days and weeks going on. But it's also International Happiness at Work Week. And being supported at work is kind of the least that our employers could be expected to do, right? Or if you are an employer or a team leader or you have customers, then it's kind of the least that we can do for them as well at the same time. And another important reason why I'm doing this is because a lot of things, quite rightly, focus on autistic children. And I think one thing that a lot of people kind of don't connect is that autistic children become autistic adults. And there's probably a lot of autistic adults out there that don't even know that they are or neurodiverse or any neurodiverse condition. So that's why this is important as well. So what we're going to cover today. So initially, when I created this, it stemmed from providing more information about autism and ADHD, but I didn't just want it to be about that because neurodiversity covers a range of different conditions. So I'm going to talk to you about those as well today, as well as talking about ways that have been helpful in supporting people with these different conditions. So whether it's you yourself, whether it's someone you know personally or professionally, hopefully it will give you something to take away to actively make a positive difference. So you can expect then what we mean by neurodiversity, an overview of dyslexia, dyscalculia and Tourette's, a bit of a further focus on autism and ADHD, suggestions throughout to support neurodiverse people and where to get further support. So I just want to check at this point. So either in the chat box or if you want to unmute yourself or whatever, does anyone have any questions at this point? We're good. Okay. So first of all, then, this term, what do we mean by these words neurodiverse and neurodiversity? Well, the dictionary definition of the word is, well, kind of opposed to being neurotypical, which in other words, being neurodiverse means being different from the typical neurological type of the nation. So in English, that means being different how people typically would be expected to think and how to process the world. And sometimes you might notice that different acronyms are used, like ND and NT, and they literally mean neurotypical and neurodiverse. So the term neurodivergent then refers to this idea that the human brain, it's quite natural for it to have differences, and they're normal from person to person. And in many cases, these can actually lead to quite meaningful and positive insights and abilities. And people are described as being neurodiverse simply when their thought patterns, behaviours or learning styles fall outside of what's considered to be normal or neurotypical. And although the term generally tends to be associated with people who have autism or ADHD, it's important to recognise that neurodiversity relates to a range of developmental conditions, including dyslexia, dyscalculia and Tourette's. And these are lifelong conditions that people don't grow out of. And also within themselves, a spectrum condition, again, more of which we can explore shortly. And one of the important things to take away is that neurodiversity has no reflection on intelligence, though due to processing different information in different ways, it could mean that neurodiverse people might have to learn or work in different ways that are more in harmony with their way of interpreting the world rather than how everybody else seems to. So now at this point, you might have realised that my skills don't lie in PowerPoint design, but hopefully what I'm going to tell you will somewhat make it up for it. But here I want to either introduce you to or reacquaint you with some neurodiverse conditions I've already mentioned the names of. Maybe you or someone you know has had a diagnosis of one of these. Maybe you're curious about them, or maybe it might be that you recognise some of these traits in yourself and want to know where to get further support. And also at the end of this, if anyone would like me to email them some support websites or put those in the chat, please let me know and I'll be happy to get those to you. So first off, I'm going to talk about dyslexia. And it's a condition that a lot of people have heard of. But did you know that dyslexia isn't just about someone's ability to process letters and words? I mean, certainly it can have an impact on these things. And in fact, one of the characteristics of dyslexia is having poorly organised written work that lacks expression. For example, even though somebody might be really knowledgeable about a certain subject, they might have issues expressing that knowledge in their writing. And then because dyslexic people tend to have poorer spelling and difficulty taking notes, as well as copying information, it means that they're more likely to avoid reading or writing whenever possible because it's not a positive experience. But it's not just writing that can be affected. It can also have an impact on people's abilities to plan and organise emails, letters, reports, memory. So remembering things like PIN numbers and phone numbers. And when you kind of apply this to daily organisation or trying to manage a work-life balance, it can mean that some people might struggle to meet deadlines, just kind of juggling all this together. And looking back as well, people with dyslexia might have difficulty revising for exams. And that can be a difficulty of, or a combination really, of difficulty writing and note taking, so being able to take in that information and write it at the same time, and then organising that information they've got and being able to recall it. And then in the workplace, that can impact things like sales pitches and interviews where it's about organising and recalling that information. But even so, it doesn't have any reflection on anyone's intelligence. And even though there are things that people with dyslexia might have difficulties with now or might have done in the past, and there are things that can help. I'm going to talk about a few of those now. So it's been found that a lot of people with dyslexia find it easier to organise their work on different coloured paper, or if they're typing, on different coloured backgrounds for screens. Now, the most common colour seems to be yellow, although this isn't necessarily the case for everyone, but single colour backgrounds are best without any patterns or busy background designs. That's one thing to take into consideration. You know, is there coloured paper available? Is there the capacity to be able to change the screen colour? Another useful one is you quite often hear about speech to text, but text to speech software, because that's really, really useful if you're having chunks of text read aloud. And say for any employers, or if you've got any customers or anybody really you're interacting with, or where you're producing content, for example, online, just making sure that the text is quite easily interpreted for it. In fact, the British Dyslexia Association have got an article about dyslexia-friendly workplaces, so I can always share the link with that as well. But again, that's it, how we use the technology can be quite helpful there as well, being able to take that in. So making use of spell checkers, whatever platform you're using. Now, most writing applications these days do have a spell checker. So if this is something that anybody struggles with, whatever platform you're typing on, and whether that's an email, whether it's on social media, or it might even be that your company uses specific software that you have to put information in, you could always use something like Microsoft Word to actually write the information and spell check it, and then copy that and paste it across to whatever application that you're writing in, because then you can be quite confident that you've written it, there are no mistakes in it, and it can go where you need to. Digital recording devices as well are really helpful at reducing anxiety about remembering information when you've got to take notes. I mean, obviously, if sensitive information is being shared, there might be issues with doing this in certain circumstances. But most phones, for example, have got a voice recorder. So if you are attending a meeting or lecture, anything where there's spoken word, always worth asking permission if you can record it, and then in your own time you can listen back to that and take any notes without anybody having to rush you or you having to stop people kind of, you know, mid-speech to get down what they're saying. And there's quite a lot of little hacks and things that are available to us like that we don't always utilize, so certainly something to be considered. And if you're either running or taking part in a meeting where, you know, there's documents that people need to be able to take in at the time, make sure that they're distributed in advance where possible, so that they're not just handed out there and then in the meeting. Then the information's there already. People have got time to read it, understand it, and process it before going into there and having to look at it on the spot. And there are other little hacks as well that you can have in place, like if you have some emails that you commonly send in the same format, have a draft that you can copy and paste so that you've only got to amend minimal parts of it. The same for any report templates as well. Anything that's going to make that easier and make that less of an anxiety-inducing process. If it fits around you and what you're doing, go for it. And so then we come on to dyscalculia, and this is counted as a learning difficulty that can affect an individual's ability to do basic arithmetic. So that's like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And we find that adults with dyscalculia can often take longer when they're working with numbers and might be more prone to make mistakes in calculations. And also estimation skills can be affected as well. And this could lead to experiencing higher levels of anxiety and frustration, because it could be harder for adults with dyscalculia to learn and recall maths facts such as times tables. And again, dyscalculia isn't a reflection of low intelligence, and it doesn't mean that an adult won't be successful when they're working through higher order mathematical reasoning. But a lot of people with dyscalculia do have this belief that they're simply bad at maths because it's involved in loads of different areas of the school curriculum as well, if you look back, because it impacts things like physics, chemistry. And back then, a lot of children might have felt that they were less capable of achieving success. So it can have a really big impact on their confidence, because then over time, those feelings can develop into low self-confidence and low self-esteem. And then adults with poorer math skills are more likely to suffer in terms of career opportunities and managing personal finances. There's also a greater chance that they might be struggling with more than one condition, such as having dyslexia as well, or even ADHD. That's why it's important for individuals who've got undiagnosed dyscalculia to see if they can get a diagnosis to then access any help and support that they might need to be successful. So I've got a bit of an overview of dyscalculia, and again, some ways that might be helpful in supporting somebody with dyscalculia, whether that's you, someone you know, someone within a personal or professional capacity, are having a calculator handy, which I know sounds really, really obvious, but one of the most recommended accommodations for adults with dyscalculia is using a calculator for sort of addition, multiplication, subtraction, division. And in this day and age, obviously, we know it's not practical to carry a calculator around with you. And also, if it's something that arises in the moment, you really want to be scrambling around in your bag or wherever for a calculator anyway. So instead, it might be an idea to have the calculator app on your phone, on your home screen, because that way you always know that it's there, and it can save you from getting flustered as well. And you know what as well, if you do struggle with numbers on a day-to-day basis, don't be embarrassed to reach for the calculator as many times as necessary. If you're an employer, make sure that for everyone, the calculator app is on the desktop or in an easy place to find, so that everybody knows where it is then and it doesn't become a big deal. So maths facts are equations, and this includes things like simple sums like 1 + 1 = 2 and times tables. Think back to when you were in primary school and you're there reciting the times tables by rote. That's an example of a maths fact. And it can be quite useful to commit those to memory so that they can become an automatic thought. So that would mean then that you could skip that initial calculation step and then solve some mathematical problems without needing a pen or paper or calculator. Because individuals with dyscalculia and dyslexia might struggle to learn maths facts, it's quite a good idea to try multisensory approaches. So that could be writing them out whilst saying them aloud, so it's utilising different senses as well whilst learning the information. And then they kind of go from being maths facts to maths hacks. For example, is it possible to do yourself a cheat sheet of things like some arithmetic, some subtraction, some multiplication and division on a little document on your phone or the computer or something? So any commonly arisen ones, they're just, again, they're easy to access. So it takes some of that pressure off having to do that calculation or recall it. Another positive use of mobile technology is using banking apps, because they can be really, really helpful when it comes to managing personal finances, because that, let's be honest, can become quite a source of stress. Not just having to deal with looking at what's coming in, what's going out, bills are rising, but dealing with the actual maths aspect of it on top. So if anybody does struggle with money management, there are quite a few free apps that can help. Again, I've got a link to some that were recommended by Which that are free to install and use. But then also, Citizens Advice are fantastic at being able to point people in the right direction for community counselling and advice on money management. So absolutely never be afraid to reach out to these guys for help or downloading an app, because sometimes getting the incomings and outgoings down on paper and actually taking time to process those numbers can make a really, really big difference in like relieving the stress and anxiety that's associated with money. So that can be quite a useful thing. And the last one, which sounds weird, but get excited about maths. Because if you're feeling positive about something, like positive thoughts and emotions can actually go a long way in combating maths anxiety. And that is a real thing. Because I remember as well when I was at uni that some of the lecturers there were doing a lot of research into maths anxiety and where it comes from and what can help to alleviate it. And if you're feeling more positive and understanding the purpose about something, that can help to give you the energy and the motivation to keep going and to pursue further education to improve your skills. I mean, some people as well find that the environment, for whatever reason, wasn't right at school. And so then have returned to studying maths as an adult in their own environment, in their own time. And because they've found that studying more independently or more in a way that suits them, there isn't that same pressure of everyone having to do the same thing the same way like there was at school. So even that can make a positive difference. But again, there's a few suggestions regarding supporting people with dyscalculia. Again, at this stage, just want to check, does anyone have any questions or any comments so far? If not, I'm also just going to take the opportunity to have a quick sip of drink. Okay, so the next one that I'm going to talk to you about now is Tourette syndrome. And a lot of people don't realise that Tourette's is also a neurodiverse condition. It's characterised by physical and vocal tics that include things like shouting, grunting, twitching, blinking, and also clearing the throat. It's 3 to 4 times more prevalent in boys, but the illustration here is just a reminder that girls can also have the condition. And that's an interesting fact as well about how a lot of neurodiverse conditions do seem to be recognised quicker in males than they do females. But that's not the main part of the discussion today. Now, most people with Tourette syndrome, they experience a strong urge before they have a tic. And they've quite often described it as that feeling that you get before you need to scratch an itch or you need to sneeze. And these feelings are known as premonitory sensations, and they can only be relieved after the tic's been carried out. And examples of what this feels like for somebody with Tourette's could be a bit like a burning feeling in the eyes before you blink, or a dry or sore throat before grunting. Some other people might experience an itchy joint or muscle before jerking. And so it can be experienced and manifest in different ways. And I remember seeing a programme as well a few years ago, I think it was on Channel 4, that was a documentary about people with Tourette's. And I remember one man describing it as, particularly when it came to vocal tics, that it's so sort of focused on not doing it and holding it in, that then that urge becomes so great that it has to do it to relieve this feeling. Now, some people find that they can control their tics for a short while in certain social situations, like a meeting, for example, or an interview. And it requires concentration, but it is something that can get easier with practice. And as well, controlling tics can be quite tiring. And so as a result of that, someone might have a sudden release of tics after a day of trying to control them, like returning home from a day at work or college or uni. Another thing as well is that tics could be less noticeable during activities that involve a high level of concentration. So things like reading, or something really interesting, or playing sports. And then it's interesting because looking at supporting somebody with Tourette's, these are things that I feel could be applied supporting anybody really with any kind of neurodiverse condition. So certainly bear that in mind as well with these. Like one of them being creating a supportive environment, because one thing that can, for want of a better word, disable people with Tourette's, particularly employees, is like having a negative social perception. So if you're creating a supportive environment that's free of any judgment, that actually facilitates empowerment. And if you're creating that sort of environment as well for anybody, then of course you're being more compliant then with the Equality Act, for example. And this might seem quite obvious or quite basic advice, but there are some tics that people with Tourette's may have that can be very noticeable because of kind of like how intense or obvious they are, like yelling, jumping, making sounds. And thing is as well, no matter how exaggerated some of the tics might appear to be, the best thing is to just act natural and pretend not to notice them. Because even if you're curious, we know that it's quite rude to stare if someone's behaving in that way. And if they've got a tic that might affect their speech, like cause speech interruptions, again, just being patient, letting people express their thoughts, because we probably know as well, it can be really frustrating if someone doesn't let you finish a sentence. But it could be even more so if you've got difficulty doing that in the first place. So it's making sure that that environment is welcoming for somebody to express themselves and be themselves how they are without any judgment. And sometimes as well, people might need a break. So an environment that allows for this, again, is quite ideal. Now, stress and anxiety, again, whether that's in a work situation or a personal situation, could make tics worse. So being able to take regular breaks can really, really help people with Tourette's, or also any other neurodiverse condition, to manage stress, and that can then help reduce subsequent tics. And that could also be used as well for people to engage in tics, which can then enhance concentration for working if needed. But yeah, breaks can be really, really important. Now, if you notice as well that whether it's your friend or your colleague are having a lot of tics, more than usual, this could be indicative that they are feeling more nervous or more anxious than usual for whatever reason. It might be that they're going through a time of extra stress, or that they're in a new place, in public, or they might even feel like they're in a situation where they are feeling observed and they are feeling judged by strangers. But in these kinds of situations, if you do know it, you can help by subtly offering a way out. For example, saying, I'm going to go and grab some coffee. Do you want to come, or do you want to go for a walk? But offering that way out can be really, really helpful. It could be, again, like, I want to get some fresh air. Do you want to come with me? Because a lot of people with Tourette syndrome as well find that fresh air or a different space or a change in scenario can actually help reset the brain as well. So it's, being aware of that and subtly being able to ask if they need that sort of support. Now, this one really goes without saying, and I know that I shouldn't have to sit here and say this, but don't joke about it, because it is a sensitive issue. And although humour can often be used to downplay a complicated matter, determining whether it's appropriate to make jokes or not will depend entirely on them, because some people will use humour as a means of kind of like coping with and living with their experiences. Of course, it does tend to work better with adults than children, but it really depends on that individual and on the moment, because there might be some days where your friend or a colleague, they're really not in the mood for joking about it. It's really not the time. Or there might be times when they are, because sometimes laughing at ourselves as well, if we make the joke, can be quite healthy from time to time. But it's all about being in tune with the person, whether it's a colleague, friend. If you know them well and know their level of humour, by all means go with it. But obviously, if it's someone that you don't know well, just going by their lead, and doing best to make them feel comfortable and then feel welcome. And then, last but not least, is another way that you can potentially support somebody with Tourette's to minimise their exposure to any triggers or distractions. Some examples might include noise, open spaces, stress, anxiety, any additives or stimulants as well. Now, these are examples because they can be quite overwhelming and they could potentially make tics worse as well. So again, just as any reasonable adjustments that people have will be individualised, triggers and distractions will also vary. So it's always helpful to have those conversations with people and say, are there any triggers? Is there anything that we can do to make the environment or your space more comfortable for you? And again, that works with other kind of sensory related neurodiverse conditions like autism and ADHD. So again, opportunity, if anyone does have any questions, either ask them or put in the chat box. But if we're good, I'm going to move on to the next part now, which is more of a focus on autism and ADHD. So say, I've had a look at a few different neurodiverse conditions, quite common, and what they're characterised by, and potential ways that could be helpful supporting individuals that live with those conditions. But now it's more of a focus on autism and ADHD. And I've kind of put these together in terms of the support and in particular myths about them, because there are lots of overlapping factors and symptoms between the two. And in fact, you may have noticed that with the other conditions that I've talked about already this evening. But it's important to remember, though, that they are distinctly different conditions, but they may present in similar ways. And it's also not uncommon for people to have both as well. So the National Autistic Society, if you have a look on there and you're thinking you've never heard of autism before, it states it's a lifelong developmental disability which affects how people communicate and interact with the world. And interestingly, 1 in 100 people are on the autism spectrum, and there are around 700,000 autistic adults and children in the UK. I mean, we could potentially debate these figures. Now, I and many other people might not necessarily agree with the different definition that it's a developmental disability. However, when you compare the experience of an autistic person with a neurotypical person trying to navigate a world that's designed for neurotypical people, I can see where this aspect of the definition comes from. But looking at that even further, what is autism? And so it's a diagnosed condition. So that means that it meets the criteria within the DSM-5, and the ICD-10 in the United States. And these are basically the medical guidelines, if you like, that hold the criteria for diagnosing any neurodivergent condition or developmental condition or anything to do with the brain, so we'll say mental illnesses as well. And it's a spectrum condition, meaning that autistic people are unique in their own experiences of the condition, but commonly share some similarities like sensory processing difficulties or communication and social relations difficulties, or difficulty interpreting and expressing emotions, for example, in themselves and in others. And autistic adults can often feel quite dysregulated within themselves and the environment, and might also self-stimulate to compensate for this through various behaviours like tapping, humming, running, shaking their legs, or any other ritualistic behaviour. A lot of the time might not even notice they're doing it as well. I know I, for one, I suddenly realise I'm doing it myself. I'm like, oh yeah, stimming. But as autistic people do perceive the world in a different way, and having these kind of like resulting communication barriers can make it quite hard then to access education, help and support. And some autistic people might also have learning difficulties, although it's really important to point out that autism within itself isn't a learning disability. Now, for people with sensory processing disorder, it can make some environments quite difficult for autistic people to be in, whether that's due to the noise, colour, brightness, the presence of other people, or even the smells that a lot of neurotypical people wouldn't notice or might not notice or be impacted by. And it's true as well that a lot of autistic people like routine and like to know what's going to happen, because uncertainty or sudden changes can be quite difficult to deal with as well. And being autistic can be quite difficult, especially if somebody's undiagnosed, because individuals then can feel quite isolated, like they're missing something or just not fitting in with the rest of the world, and that can have an impact on social relationships and also on communication difficulties. And quite often as well, when autistic people do feel overwhelmed, it can result in what's known as a meltdown, which again can be expressed in different ways depending on the individual. For example, young children might have what looks like an absolutely almighty tantrum that they find really, really difficult to get out of, whereas adults could have a tantrum, but then they might cry or withdraw or stop speaking, or they could make rash decisions as well. Now, there's no cure for autism. However, some autistic children and adults might seek out therapy to help with comorbid conditions like anxiety and OCD. But it is something that autistic people always have and always will have. And it has an impact on how we process the world, but it's different for different people. So a lot of people kind of refer to Asperger's as well and kind of ask, well, is that the same as autism? Is it a different thing? Is it separate? Well, it's kind of a bit of a weird answer, because it's kind of like yes and no. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So Asperger's isn't something that's diagnosed separately, but a very old and outdated distinction used to be that autistic people with classic autism preferred to be alone and weren't actually interested in making friends, and just wanted to kind of live in their own world, quite insular. Whereas those with Asperger's did value the company of other people and did want to be friends and be social, but didn't have the social or the communication skills to want to do so. But the reality is that autism isn't so black and white. And the reason now why there aren't any separate diagnoses now is because it's recognised that autism's autism. It's such a spectrum condition that different people fit the criteria in different ways, and it no longer seems necessary to have different types, for want of a better word. And this also raises a point about terminology, because you might have heard the terms as well about high functioning and low functioning, or different types of autism. And these terms are quite problematic, because all autistic children and adults have experienced or still experience barriers to fitting in, whether that's in education, speech, social communication, whatever it is. And it just seems so unfair to divide such a diverse condition into different hierarchies. It almost makes out as well that there's a good type of autism and a bad type. And some people as well find in the autistic community find referring to Asperger's syndrome as offensive because the paediatrician who first noted it in his case books had quite problematic history with ties to the Nazis as well. So again, not association that you want to have. And the final point here is that in general, a lot of autistic people like to be referred as such, as autistic, because it's part of our identity. It's not an illness or a disease, and it's not something that can be left at home either, like an umbrella or a handbag. And also, again, this is just a personal thing, but it's less effort to say they're autistic than they have autism. So, but again, language can be really, really important to people. So that's why I probably referred to autistic people rather than saying have autism. Again, not everyone's going to have this preference, but it is something that's quite important to a lot of people. And so before we have a look at ADHD as well, any questions regarding autism or comments? Good. Okay. So what is ADHD? And even though I still have to take my time and be careful when I remember what it stands for. So it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And you know what? It's probably one of the most misconceived diagnoses as well. And it's usually recognised and diagnosed in childhood, but more and more adults are being diagnosed now. And people with ADHD, they show this persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity. But these behaviours can actually interfere with the day-to-day functioning as well as their development. And although, again, usually recognised in childhood, more and more adults are being diagnosed now. Now, people that have ADHD might express purely inattentive symptoms, or they might have purely hyperactive symptoms, or they might have a combination of both. But the impact that ADHD has can differ with age, which reflects both kind of the changing maturity of the individual and the changing kind of circumstances and expectations that are on them as well. And as they mature, an individual might be able to better cope, but they might continue to struggle because of the increased behavioural expectations on them. And some people as well find that ADHD can severely impact their enjoyment of other activities, for example, reading or watching a film. Unlike autism, ADHD, again, it can't be cured, but some of the symptoms can be treated with medication as well. But again, it can be a case of finding the right one that has a positive impact and getting that right. So when we talk about these inattentive symptoms and hyperactive symptoms, so inattentive symptoms could look like having difficulty concentrating on tasks that require sustained mental effort, even if you want to. So if you wanted to sit and read a book, but just don't have that concentration, be able to do it. Could be quite forgetful or easily distracted, kind of going from one thing to another as well. And then on the hyperactivity side, it could look like excessive talking, having difficulty waiting for their turn, or having to fidget and finding it quite difficult to actually remain seated as well. Again, these are just a few examples of what that can look like. And it could be one, it could be the other, or it could be a combination of all of them. Again, it depends on the individual. But again, like autism as well, ADHD is met by criteria in the DSM-5 or the ICD-10. So it is again a recognised diagnosable condition. And there can be a lot of misconceptions about autism and about ADHD. And hopefully this will bust some of those as well now. And one of them that's kind of my favourite is, but you don't look autistic. And it's like, well, what does autism look like? Should we wear a badge or something like that? You can't determine if somebody's autistic or has ADHD by what they look like, unless they really are and they're wearing a t-shirt or a badge that says I'm autistic or I have ADHD. But yeah, it's quite a common one don't know if anyone's experienced being told that before, but hey. Another one, we're all a little bit autistic, aren't we? Well, no, in the same way that women aren't a little bit pregnant, or you don't have a little bit of a broken bone. And you know what? Whilst many of the population might share traits or characteristics with autistic people, those that are diagnosed with the condition or with ADHD, it usually means that it's had an adverse impact on their life in one way or another. And so it's not just about everyone being a little bit on the spectrum. Again, this idea that you must have this amazing talent, like you must be really, really good at maths or drawing or being a music whiz. And you know what? Some people might be, but it could be more to do with logic or number recognition, or maybe somebody has a special interest in drawing or playing the piano, so they're investing literally all their time and energy into doing that. So naturally, they're going to get good at it. Yeah, you get a few people, few and far between, that are savants, that are also autistic, but unfortunately it doesn't automatically mean that you're amazing at these things just based on your neurotype. Should do though. People with ADHD are hyper all the time. Well, no, not necessarily. In fact, a lot of people with ADHD might actually find it so hard to focus on things and get things done that they're more likely to disassociate and withdraw and kind of be, bouncing around everywhere. And then this idea that people with autism or ADHD don't understand jokes and sarcasm. Some people don't, because they have quite a rigid way of thinking and might take things quite literally, particularly if they're younger. Like with children, for example, with sayings like schools breaking up or raining cats and dogs, might take those phrases literally. But generally, of course, we've still got a good sense of humour and are able to be probably more so sarcastic, I think, than a lot of people. So that's absolutely a myth. And then this idea that neurodiverse people are rude, either ignoring you or constantly interrupting you. Well, hopefully now, knowing a bit more about the conditions, you'll realise that not being rude, especially if it comes to having conversations and genuinely not knowing when it's their turn to speak, it's just something I've experienced, they literally can't help it and will probably feel absolutely mortified and thinking that you've been, upset or offended inadvertently. But these are just some of the kind of myths or misconceptions that can surround these conditions. So hopefully some of those are laid to rest now. But going on from there and actually supporting people with autism and ADHD. Now, some of these might mirror what I've spoken about earlier when we were talking about dyslexia, dyscalculia and Tourette's. And a lot of things might overlap about that support, but hey, can't ever be a bad thing to reiterate supportive information. But again, talking about the environment. So people who experience sensory processing disorders might find the lights, colours, sounds, textures and the temperature quite difficult. And when people are in their own homes, they usually adapt to their environment to suit them. But if you're in a public place or somewhere different, that could have an impact. It's always good to consider this and make sure that the person that you're with is comfortable. Again, with communication, neurodiverse people can quite often struggle with this. And it might be that they don't make eye contact, or the answers that you get might be quite abrupt. And might also, as I mentioned in the previous slide, interrupt or talk for a long time about a subject. So remember to give people time to express their needs, and also using active listening skills as well to ascertain that you've understood each other during this. And as mentioned about the language as well, talking about first person language, referring to someone who's autistic, not someone with autism. And some autistic people will stim or self-stimulate, as mentioned. Now, this could be clicking a pen or playing with their fingers, tapping their fingers. And a lot of the time, you might not realise that they're doing it. And it's best not to discourage this behaviour, because it could also be an indicator that the person that you're with isn't comfortable. And it can also be quite a self-soothing thing. So if there is someone there clicking a pen, on and off, might be that they literally don't realise that they're doing it. It's a self-stimulation thing and helping them to regulate. Allowing breaks, whether that's sensory breaks or even some time to get up from whatever they're doing or you're doing, just to regulate and recenter. It's always quite helpful. And also breaking tasks up. And particularly if somebody's got ADHD, they might find it hard to concentrate for a long time or find that quite overwhelming. So if that task is then broken up into steps, then that might be easier to manage and deal with rather than feeling overwhelmed with it all at once. But then if someone's disclosed to you that they are neurodiverse, ask what you can do to support them, or if there's anything that they feel you need to know about them and what their needs are. As I say, if someone's already given you that information, then it's absolutely appropriate for you to say, you know, thanks for disclosing that to me. What can I do to support you? And also an important reminder as well is that anybody who's neurodiverse might possibly be fighting daily battles on multiple fronts, because if someone's got Tourette's, there's constant battles with tics, and if you've got dyslexia, with understanding and being able to express yourself in written speech as well. There's that battle of acceptance as well in society. You know, you just can't do things the same way that other people seem to be able to. And people might stare, or you might even have been used to unpleasant comments as well. There's also, you know, whether you're accepted as you are for who you are in society. So the important thing is as well, just to be kind and just to be patient and be mindful of other people's experiences as well, because something that might be obvious to you might not be to me, something to me might not be to you. So it's just being aware of other people's experiences and expectations, whatever their neurotype is, and something that we can all do with being reminded of sometimes. So final bit is what to do if I or someone I know suspects they might be autistic or have ADHD. Now, this could also reflect the other neurotypes that I talked about earlier, but my experience has been with autism and ADHD, which is why I'm specifically referring to that here. So the first being to see your GP, because they can refer you then to adult autism or ADHD services for an assessment and a potential diagnosis. Now, it can take a long time if you're doing this through the NHS. There are options of going private, but obviously that comes at a cost. You can only be diagnosed though as an adult by a psychiatrist or a counselling psychologist, and in children it's a community paediatrician. You'd probably be asked to fill out the AQ50, which is the Autism Quotient 50. You can search for it on Google, and it's currently the top result on Bing. And although this doesn't give you a formal diagnosis, it can give you an indication of whether it's worth you pursuing a diagnosis or not by answering some questions, and then depending on the score that you get. And the National Autistic Society and ADHD UK websites have also got a wealth of information for both children and adults who either are or suspect that they might be neurodiverse. So they're always really, really good resources to have a look at as well. And a lot of people as well might feel that they fit the criteria of having either autism, ADHD, or Tourette's, Dyscalculia, Dyslexia, but don't feel that they would benefit from having a diagnosis. Again, that's fine. Some people choose that option, and that's okay too. But it's always a good starting point anyway to have a word with the GP, note down what your reasons are for that visit, for suspecting that, and taking it from there. So that brings us now to the end of this webinar. Do you know what? My first one that I've actually done for free in front of people as well, being Wiz. So at this point, if there are, in fact, I will stop the recording before I do ask any questions or comments.